There was a time when Los Angeles represented the American dream in its purest form, when palm trees swayed against endless blue skies and the promise of reinvention hung in the warm California air like perfume. But something has fundamentally shifted in recent years, something that residents whisper about in grocery store lines and newcomers notice within days of arrival. A transformation so profound that people who've lived in LA for decades now find themselves asking if the city they once loved even exists anymore. Why has Los Angeles, the sprawling metropolis that once symbolized opportunity, glamour, and the future itself, become a place where nobody can stand living anymore? The answer isn't found in a single catastrophic event, but in 9 alarming signs that reveal an uncomfortable truth about what's really happening to the City of Angels, a truth that city officials downplay, that real estate developers ignore, and that millions of residents experience every single day as they navigate an urban landscape that feels increasingly unlivable, unsafe, and utterly out of control. The first sign appeared gradually, then suddenly, like bankruptcy in a Hemingway novel, the absolute explosion of homelessness that has transformed entire neighborhoods into open-air crisis zones. We're not talking about a few unfortunate souls on Skid Row anymore. We're talking about sprawling encampments that stretch for city blocks, tent cities that have become permanent features of the landscape in areas that once represented wealth and prestige. Venice Beach, once the bohemian paradise where artists and dreamers gathered to celebrate California cool, now resembles a refugee camp where tourists pick their way nervously through makeshift shelters, human waste, and the debris of lives falling apart in public view. Santa Monica, the gleaming seaside community where movie stars once strolled, now hosts encampments under freeway overpasses and in parks where children used to play without fear. And it's not just the beach communities. Drive through Hollywood, through downtown, through neighborhoods in the San Fernando Valley, and you'll see the same pattern repeating. Tents clustered on sidewalks, makeshift structures built from tarps and shopping carts, people living in vehicles that haven't moved in months, creating zones of desperation that coexist uneasily with million-dollar homes just blocks away. Official counts claim there are roughly 60,000 homeless individuals in Los Angeles County, but anyone who works with these populations will tell you the real number is likely far higher, and more importantly, that the number keeps growing despite billions spent on solutions that never quite seem to solve anything. Residents describe feeling unsafe walking to their own cars, stepping over needles and human feces on sidewalks they pay property taxes to maintain, watching as encampments grow larger and more entrenched while city officials offer press conferences instead of solutions. The psychological impact of this visible desperation cannot be overstated. It's the daily reminder that the social contract has broken down, that the systems meant to catch people before they fall have catastrophically failed, that the distance between housed and unhoused might be smaller than anyone wants to admit. But wait, because the second sign is intimately connected to the first and might be even more terrifying for those trying to maintain normal lives. The crime wave that has turned Los Angeles from a city where you took reasonable precautions into a place where nowhere feels truly safe anymore. We're not just talking about property crime, though that has exploded to levels that would have been unimaginable a decade ago, with cars broken into so routinely that residents have started leaving signs saying nothing valuable inside and doors unlocked to avoid broken windows. We're talking about brazen daylight robberies, smash and grab operations, where organized groups storm into luxury boutiques on Rodeo Drive and clear out entire displays in under 60 seconds, while security guards watch helplessly. Follow home robberies, where criminals stake out expensive restaurants and trail patrons to their residences. Violent carjackings that happen at stoplights in supposedly safe neighborhoods. The statistics tell one story, but the lived experience tells another. Talk to anyone who's been in LA for more than a few years and they'll have a story, either their own or a close friend's, of being victimized or threatened, of feeling the city's edge getting sharper and more dangerous. What's particularly disturbing is the sense that consequences have evaporated. that the same individuals cycle through arrests and releases, that police often don't even respond to property crimes anymore because they're overwhelmed and because district attorney policies have essentially decriminalized theft under certain thresholds. Businesses that have operated in Los Angeles for generations are closing their doors, not because they're not profitable, but because the constant theft, the broken windows, the threatening encounters have made continuing operations untenable. High-end retailers in downtown LA have erected barriers that make their stores look like fortresses. Pharmacies have locked up basic items like toothpaste and deodorant behind plexiglass, and even major chain stores have announced closures in neighborhoods where shoplifting has become so routine it's factored into business models as an acceptable loss. Except it's no longer acceptable, and the losses are no longer sustainable. The third sign strikes at something even more fundamental than safety: the absolute collapse of affordability that has made Los Angeles functionally unlivable for anyone not earning 6 figures or more. The median home price in Los Angeles County has surpassed $900,000, a number so disconnected from median incomes that it would be laughable if it weren't tragic, pushing homeownership beyond the reach of teachers, nurses, firefighters, the very people who make a city function. But even those who've given up on buying face a rental market that borders on predatory. One-bedroom apartments in decent neighborhoods command $3,000 a month or more. Studio apartments in less desirable areas still run $2,000. And even these inflated prices often come with additional requirements like making 3 times the rent in monthly income, which creates a mathematical impossibility for huge swaths of the population. The result is a city where people with full-time jobs live in their cars, where multiple families crowd into units designed for one, where commutes stretch to 3 or 4 hours each way, because that's how far people have to move to find anything remotely affordable. Young professionals who came to Los Angeles chasing careers in entertainment or technology find themselves in their 30s and 40s still living with roommates or in converted garages, unable to start families or build equity, watching their lives on pause while they pour 70 or 80% of their income into keeping a roof over their heads. And the cruelty is compounded by the fact that these astronomical costs don't buy you safety or cleanliness or functioning infrastructure. They buy you the privilege of still being in Los Angeles, of enduring all the other dysfunction while also hemorrhaging money at rates that make saving impossible and escape increasingly unlikely. Economists call it a housing crisis, but that term feels inadequate to describe the systematic destruction of the middle class, the evaporation of the possibility that hard work and reasonable decisions might lead to stability and comfort, the transformation of Los Angeles from a place where people came to build lives into a place where they struggle simply to survive. And that brings us to the fourth sign, one that affects every single person who tries to move through the city, the traffic nightmare that has evolved from merely frustrating to genuinely dystopian. Los Angeles has always had traffic. That's part of the city's identity. But what's happening now transcends the old jokes about the 405 freeway. We're talking about gridlock that starts before dawn and doesn't clear until late evening. Commutes that used to take 30 minutes, now taking 2 hours on a good day. Surface streets so clogged that traveling 5 miles across the city requires the kind of time commitment you'd make for a road trip. And it's not just the time lost, though that alone represents thousands of hours per year stolen from people's lives, hours they could spend with family or pursuing passions or simply sleeping. It's the psychological toll of sitting trapped in a metal box breathing exhaust fumes while your life ticks away in 15-foot increments. But here's what makes it particularly maddening. The traffic isn't getting worse because the city is thriving and growing and everyone wants to be here. It's getting worse despite massive population exodus. Worse despite remote work reducing commuters. Worse because the infrastructure is literally crumbling and the city seems incapable of fixing it. Roads are pockmarked with potholes that destroy tires and suspensions. Entire lanes close for months or years for construction projects that never seem to finish. Traffic signals malfunction and stay broken for weeks. turning busy intersections into free-for-all zones where aggression replaces order. And the promised solutions, the light rail lines and dedicated bus lanes and bicycle infrastructure, seem designed for some theoretical Los Angeles that exists in urban planners' imaginations, rather than the real city where these additions often just reduce vehicle capacity without providing viable alternatives for the vast majority of residents who have no practical choice but to drive. The result is a city where getting anywhere requires not just planning, but psychological preparation, where people decline job opportunities or social invitations based solely on how horrific the drive will be, where the simple act of moving through the urban environment has become a source of daily rage and despair. The fifth sign is something you smell before you see: the literal decay of the city's physical environment and infrastructure in ways that make parts of Los Angeles feel like a developing nation rather than one of America's premier cities. Walk through downtown and you'll encounter sidewalks slick with urine, piles of garbage that sit uncollected for days or weeks, the sweet, sick smell of decomposition mixing with exhaust fumes and desperation. Public spaces that should be shared resources have become unusable. Parks where needles and human waste make it unsafe for children to play. Bus stops that reek so badly commuters stand in the street rather than use the shelter. Public restrooms closed permanently because maintaining them became impossible. And it's not just the streets. The city's basic systems are failing in spectacular fashion. Water mains burst with increasing frequency, flooding streets and leaving neighborhoods without service for days while repairs lumber forward at bureaucratic speeds. Power outages have become routine during heat waves, not because California lacks electricity, but because the grid infrastructure is antiquated and poorly maintained. And then there's the trash. Even in neighborhoods where collection still happens theoretically, you'll see overflowing bins, illegal dumping, mattresses and furniture, and construction debris just abandoned on street corners because the systems meant to handle such waste have become so expensive and complicated that people choose to just leave their problems in public spaces. Rats have become so common in some areas that residents barely react anymore. Just another fact of life in a city that can't seem to maintain the basic standards of sanitation and order that define civilization. And perhaps most galling is that all this decay coexists with some of the highest tax burdens in the nation. Angelenos pay and pay and pay through property taxes and sales taxes and income taxes and fees and assessments, and yet the services they receive in return would embarrass a small rural town. But the problems aren't just physical, and that leads us to the sixth sign, the exodus of businesses, jobs, and economic opportunity that has transformed Los Angeles from an economic engine into an increasingly hollowed-out shell. Every month brings new announcements. Major corporations relocating headquarters to Texas or Tennessee or Florida. Production companies moving filming to Georgia or New Mexico. Tech startups choosing to launch anywhere but California. The reasons are always the same: crushing regulatory burdens, punitive tax rates, unreliable infrastructure, quality of life concerns for employees, the simple math that operating in Los Angeles costs multiples of what it costs almost anywhere else, with none of the advantages that once justified that premium. Manufacturing has fled almost entirely, taking with it the kind of middle-class jobs that once formed the backbone of the local economy. Entertainment production, the industry most closely identified with Los Angeles, increasingly happens elsewhere, with tax credits and lower costs luring projects away from the supposed center of the film and television world. And the new economy jobs in technology and finance, they're growing in Austin and Miami and Nashville, while Los Angeles watches opportunities slip away. What's left is an increasingly bifurcated economy. High-paying jobs in a few elite sectors for those with advanced degrees and connections, and low-wage service work for everyone else, with the middle hollowing out and leaving people few options beyond extreme success or struggle. Young people with ambition and options are leaving, drawn to cities where their dollars stretch further and their futures feel brighter. They're being replaced by those with no choice but to stay, trapped by circumstance or family or the sunk cost of years invested in a place that seems determined to make life as difficult as possible. The seventh sign cuts to the heart of why families especially are fleeing. the catastrophic failure of public education and child services that makes raising kids in Los Angeles feel like an exercise in either extreme privilege or sacrifice. The Los Angeles Unified School District, despite spending upwards of $20,000 per student annually, delivers outcomes that would be unacceptable almost anywhere else. Graduation rates that mask the fact that huge percentages of graduates read below grade level. Schools where violence is common enough that parents worry daily about their children's safety. Facilities that look more like prisons than learning environments, with bars on windows and metal detectors at entrances. And those are the better schools. In struggling neighborhoods, the educational neglect borders on criminal, with teacher shortages meaning classes of 40 or 50 students, textbook shortages, bathrooms that don't work, buildings literally falling apart around kids who deserve so much better. Parents who can afford it opt out entirely, enrolling children in private schools that cost as much as college tuition, creating yet another tier of inequality, yet another way that Los Angeles sorts people into winners and losers from the earliest ages. And even outside school hours, the city has become increasingly hostile to childhood itself. Parks that aren't safe, streets that aren't walkable, a car-dependent geography that isolates young people and prevents the kind of independent exploration that forms healthy development. Recreational programs have been cut to the bone. Libraries reduce hours or close branches. The infrastructure of community that once caught and supported young people has frayed to near invisibility. The result is a city where raising children feels like swimming against a relentless current, where parents exhaust themselves trying to provide opportunities and safety and normalcy while the city seems to work against them at every turn. And now we arrive at the eighth sign, the one that might explain why all the others persist despite widespread awareness and frustration, the complete dysfunction of city government and the political system that seems incapable of addressing any problem in a meaningful way. Los Angeles politics has become a sort of performance art, where officials make grand pronouncements and announce ambitious initiatives and allocate billions of dollars. And yet somehow nothing ever improves. Sometimes things actively get worse, despite or even because of interventions. Billions spent on homelessness with no measurable reduction in street camping. Hundreds of millions on traffic improvements that make congestion worse. Endless task forces and blue ribbon panels and community input sessions that produce reports nobody reads and recommendations nobody implements. The city council is mired in corruption scandals, with members indicted or resigning in disgrace while their colleagues express shock at behavior that was apparently open secret for years. Departments operate as fiefdoms, protecting turf and budgets rather than serving the public, with union agreements that make firing even egregiously incompetent employees nearly impossible, and pension obligations that consume ever larger portions of the budget while delivering diminishing services. And when citizens try to vote for change, they find themselves trapped in a system where the same political machines and special interests maintain control regardless of which individuals occupy the offices, where reform candidates get co-opted or marginalized, where the gap between campaign promises and governing reality feels unbridgeable. The dysfunction isn't just incompetence, though there's plenty of that. It's a fundamental misalignment of incentives, where those running the city are insulated from the consequences of their failures, where accountability has been systematically eliminated, where admitting the magnitude of the problems would require changes that threaten too many powerful interests to ever happen through normal political channels. Which brings us finally to the ninth and perhaps most insidious sign, the gaslighting. The insistence from those in power and those invested in the status quo that everything is actually fine, that problems are overblown, that people who complain are just negative or don't understand the complexity or should leave if they don't like it. City officials give speeches about resilience and diversity while tent cities grow in their council districts. Media outlets run puff pieces about LA's food scene or cultural offerings while ignoring the crisis unfolding on every street corner. Real estate developers promote luxury condos with breathless marketing about the LA lifestyle, while the reality for most residents bears no resemblance to the fantasy being sold. And perhaps most perversely, there's a strain of progressive politics in Los Angeles that treats acknowledging reality as somehow reactionary or uncompassionate, that insists we can't talk about crime or homelessness or dysfunction without being accused of lacking empathy or understanding, that mistakes critique of failed policies for attacks on vulnerable people, creating an environment where honest conversation becomes nearly impossible and problems metastasize behind a wall of enforced positivity and political correctness. Longtime residents who dare to say this isn't working get dismissed as NIMBYs. We're told they're part of the problem. Newcomers who express shock at conditions are told this is LA, deal with it or go back where you came from, creating a culture where denial and resignation replace the civic engagement and collective action that might actually change things.
This culture of gaslighting is toxic because it normalizes the unacceptable, because it prevents the kind of honest reckoning that must precede genuine reform, because it allows those responsible for the dysfunction to avoid accountability by reframing failure as just a different kind of success that unsophisticated critics don't appreciate. So after reviewing these 9 alarming signs, after seeing the accumulated evidence that Los Angeles faces structural problems so deep and interconnected that addressing any one without tackling all of them is futile, after understanding that the city's trajectory is not toward improvement but toward further decay, we have to confront the question that residents ask themselves in quiet moments: is Los Angeles even salvageable at this point? And understand, this isn't about nostalgia for some imaginary golden age that never existed. LA has always had problems, always had inequality and traffic and smog and earthquakes, but those challenges coexisted with dynamism and opportunity and a sense that tomorrow could be better than today. What we're witnessing now is different. It's the compounding of multiple crises, each making the others worse, creating a vicious cycle that pulls the city toward dysfunction, despite the wealth and talent and natural advantages that should make Los Angeles one of the world's great cities. The truth that nobody wants to speak aloud is that Los Angeles is failing, not in some abstract future tense way, but right now, in real time, failing the test of whether it can provide its residents with the basic elements of a dignified life: safety, affordability, cleanliness, functioning services, hope for the future.
And here's the part that many refuse to accept. The solutions aren't mysterious or impossible. They're just politically and economically inconvenient. Solving homelessness would require actually building housing at scale, not shuffling people between shelters, and enforcing laws against public camping while providing genuine alternatives, not choosing between compassion without order or order without compassion. Fixing crime would require both adequate policing and prosecution that holds people accountable, not defunding departments while simultaneously refusing to charge offenders. Making housing affordable would require massively increasing supply through permitting reform and reduced restrictions, yes, but also confronting the reality that current homeowners have financial interests in keeping prices high and preventing new construction. Reducing traffic would require both infrastructure investment and difficult choices about development patterns, about density, about whether Los Angeles wants to remain a sprawling car city or evolve into something more sustainable. Improving schools would require not just more money, which LA already spends plenty of, but fundamental reform of how those resources are used and whose interests the system serves. And fixing governance would require breaking the power of the political machines and public employee unions and special interests that have captured the system and resist any change that might threaten their positions. But maybe the most important question isn't whether we can fix Los Angeles, but whether there's actually will to do it. Because fixing these problems would require people in power to admit catastrophic failures, would require sacred cows to be slaughtered, would require policies that have been pursued for decades to be recognized as disasters and reversed, would require those who've gotten rich or powerful from the current dysfunction to accept reduced influence and wealth for the greater good. It would require the political courage to say no to NIMBY homeowners who block housing, to say yes to enforcement against people living on sidewalks,
even if it generates negative headlines, to prioritize results over process and competence over political loyalty and the needs of the many over the demands of activist minorities. It would require voters to hold officials accountable not for their intentions or rhetoric, but for measurable outcomes, to stop rewarding politicians who are good at explaining why problems persist and start demanding leaders who actually solve things. Does that will exist? Are there enough people with sufficient power and commitment willing to lead that transformation, knowing they'll face opposition from all sides, knowing they'll be called heartless or racist or corrupt regardless of their motives, knowing that fixing decades of failure requires changes so fundamental that they'll generate intense resistance? The images of Los Angeles can still be beautiful from certain angles. The golden light at sunset, the Pacific Ocean stretching to the horizon, the Hollywood sign gleaming on the hillside, the promise of dreams coming true that still draws people from around the world. But for every carefully framed photograph, there are dozens of untold stories. Families fleeing to other states, small businesses shuttering after generations, young people giving up on futures they once imagined. The slow grinding down of hope and possibility under the weight of dysfunction that nobody seems capable of addressing. Empty promises from politicians who'll be gone before their failures fully manifest. Empty sidewalks in once vibrant neighborhoods where businesses have closed and people have stopped walking. Empty dreams of what Los Angeles could be if only there was will to choose the hard path of genuine reform over the easy path of continued decline wrapped in progressive rhetoric and celebrity distractions. And maybe that's what hurts most. It's not that having a world-class Los Angeles is impossible. It's perfectly achievable. Other cities have faced similar challenges and overcome them. The resources exist, the knowledge exists, the examples of what works exist. What's missing is the collective will to demand better, the courage to reject the gaslighting and insist that what we're experiencing is unacceptable, the determination to prioritize the well-being of actual residents over the ideological commitments and financial interests that benefit from the status quo. The people who live in Los Angeles, who work there and raise families and try to build lives, deserve better than being treated as extras in someone else's social experiment or profit extraction scheme. They deserve safety and affordability and dignity and systems that work and leaders who care more about results than appearances. If you've ever felt that mix of love and frustration trying to make a life in Los Angeles, if you've lived through any of these crises personally, if you know someone whose dreams were crushed by a city that promises everything and delivers dysfunction, share your story, because only when we stop normalizing the unacceptable can we start building what we deserve. And if you found this look behind the official narrative revealing, subscribe, because the next story might expose where American cities are really heading and whether there's still time to change course before it's too late for the places we call home.